In our last session, I introduced us to this gold standard of prophecy in the Bible, Daniel. And we looked at Daniel chapter 7 and this vision that Daniel had of 4 different terrible beasts. And we made comment that this linked into chapter 2, but it also has links into chapter 8. And the 4 images that Daniel saw, first of all represented the Babylonian Empire, and then the Medes and the Persian Empire, and the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great, followed by the Roman Empire. And we talked about the accuracy of that. What we saw in the prophecies, and as we look through them, I'd encourage you to take the time to read them through. What we see in Daniel 7 is this picture of the leopard that's got 4 heads and birds' wings on the back, and how great authority this had. In chapter 8, we had that unpacked a little bit further with this idea of this goat, and how this goat had 4 prominent horns, and the goat became very powerful. But initially, this goat had a very large horn and was a very powerful horn. And horns in the Bible represent sort of leadership, kings, sources of authority. And how in the middle of its power, this horn got broken off and replaced by the 4 horns. What we see from that is that Alexander the Great was cut off in his prime and replaced by 4 generals. So we have this accuracy. But when we dig a little bit deeper with that, we realise that one of those horns relates in about 175 BC to Antiochus Epiphanes. And he came to power as one of his rulers and was vehemently opposed to the nation of Israel. In fact, he treated the nation horrifically. He was evil, and in 169 BC, he entered the temple, opposed the Jews, and it's actually from there that the Jews get the Hanukkah celebration. And what we have in this image that Daniel's describing, commentators pretty universally recognise that Antiochus Epiphanes was being talked of in this prophecy. However, at the same time, what Daniel is introducing us to is an image of something in the future, and it's where he begins to introduce us to the idea of the Antichrist. When Daniel goes on to speak about the Roman Empire and how this Roman Empire has 10 horns, these 2 images, the one through Antiochus Epiphanes and the other through the Roman Empire, whilst being partially fulfilled in their time, are also images of a precursor of something that's going to happen in the future. And in Daniel chapter 2, when we have the image of the statue, what we're getting there is man's view of these empires of power. But in Daniel chapter 7, we start to see God's perspective of these human kingdoms, these human empires of power. And in particular, God's perspective is on how destructive they are and how terrifying they are. And when Antiochus Epiphanes came to power, he summed up that evil. He summed up that opposition to God. But in verse 25, it says that he stands against the Prince of Princes. And this is where Daniel begins to introduce us to this idea that he's also speaking about something for the end of time. The images of 10 heads and centres of power are also something that he's looking forward to at the end of time. But in chapter 8 and verse 8, where we see one horn rising up to become powerful, it says that this horn's power grew very great. It extended toward the south and east and towards the glorious land of Israel. Its power reached to the heavens, where it attacked the heavenly army, throwing some of the heavenly beings and some of the stars to the ground and trampling them. It even challenged the commander of heaven's armies by cancelling the daily sacrifices offered to him and by destroying his temple. The army of heaven was restrained from responding to this rebellion, so the daily sacrifice was halted and truth was overthrown. The horn succeeded in everything it did. Daniel is beginning to introduce us to some of the things that we'll see in the book of Revelation, particularly when we start to look at what the Antichrist is and does. However, we couldn't conclude looking at Daniel's introduction to the Antichrist and looking at Daniel chapter 7 without looking at verse 9. Because what we start to see as we look in verse 9 is that although this Antichrist, this power has risen up and begun to oppose God, verse 9 talks about the Ancient of Days coming and sitting on his throne to judge. And we have this description of one who's as white as snow, hair as pure as wool, sitting on a fiery throne with wheels of blazing fire, and millions of angels ministering to him and opening the books to begin the court of session. What we see are images that we've already seen when we've looked at the Day of Judgment, images we see in the book of Revelation of the end of time. What we learn from this is that the Antichrist is rising up and is challenging God, but God has the last say. God overcomes. The Ancient of Days takes over and judgment comes. What we see as we look at this is there is a challenge to us as believers to choose which power we wish to serve for eternity. And therein lies the question for us today as we begin to unpack what Daniel has to say about the Antichrist. A bit like the question posed to Joshua: choose for yourself today who you'll serve. But as for me and my household, we chose to serve the living God.